There was something wrong with the light in Edward Caldwell's eyes. Arthur Wren, the photographer commissioned to produce the Caldwell family portrait in October of 1884, noticed it the moment the family entered his studio on Marchfield Lane in Bristol. He had photographed hundreds of families, merchants, clergymen, doctors, their wives and children arranged in careful propriety before his lens, and he had learned to read people in the few moments before they composed themselves for the camera. There was always a settling, a drawing inward, as they understood that they were about to be made permanent. But Edward Caldwell did not settle. He stood at the far edge of the parlor set Wren had arranged, the velvet chair, the painted backdrop of a garden in autumn, and he watched. Not the camera, not the studio, not even his wife Margaret, who stood a few feet away adjusting the ribbons in their daughter Clara's hair. He watched the window. The October morning outside was gray and unremarkable, the kind of sky that sits over Bristol like a lid. There was nothing to look at. But Edward Caldwell watched it with the focused attention of a man waiting for something specific. There were 4 of them in the portrait commission. Edward, 47, who owned a moderately prosperous dry goods firm on Redcliffe Street. Margaret, his wife, 43, a thin woman with careful posture and eyes the color of old stone. Their daughter Clara, 15, a quiet girl who moved carefully, as though she was afraid of making sounds. And then the 4th member of the family, the one Arthur Wren noticed last, a young man of perhaps 19 or 20, standing slightly behind the others, very still. His name, Margaret told Wren when she filled in the commission register, was Thomas, their son. Thomas Caldwell did not speak during the entire session. He stood where he was placed, in the arrangement Wren indicated, behind and slightly to the right of his father, and he kept his face composed in an expression that Wren could not quite name. It was not a smile, it was not a frown. It was the face of someone performing composure rather than feeling it. His skin, Wren noticed, had an unusual pallor. Not the pallor of illness, more a quality of suspension, as if Thomas existed at a slightly different temperature than the room around him. The studio was warm. Wren kept a coal fire burning in October to prevent the subjects from shivering during the long exposure. Thomas Caldwell did not appear to register the warmth. "Your son is quite reserved," Wren said to Margaret as he adjusted the camera, making conversation the way he always did to relax a family before the plate was exposed. Margaret Caldwell turned and looked at Thomas. The look lasted only a second, but in that second something passed across her face that Arthur Wren would spend the next 3 years trying to correctly identify. He would eventually decide it was not love, not grief, not pride. It was the look of a woman checking that a lock was still fastened. "He has always been quiet," she said. The portrait was taken. Wren exposed the plate, thanked the family, indicated they could collect the finished print in 4 days. The Caldwells arranged themselves to leave. Clara put on her coat with the mechanical movements of a child who had learned not to complain. Edward continued looking at the window. Margaret fastened her gloves button by button with extraordinary deliberateness. Thomas Caldwell was the last to leave the studio. At the door, he paused. Wren was already moving toward his darkroom, but something made him look back. Thomas was standing in the doorway, standing in it the way a man stands when he is not entirely certain he is permitted to pass through. And he was looking at Wren directly. The look lasted only a moment. Then he was gone. 4 days later, when Arthur Wren developed the portrait and held it up to the lamp to examine it before framing, his hand went cold. Thomas Caldwell's eyes in the photograph were open, wide open, not with the stiffness of the long exposure, not the blank gaze that sometimes came when subjects forgot to blink at the correct moment. Open in a way that was wrong, the irises too prominent, the whites too visible, the expression in them entirely absent. Every other member of the family had the small dimness in the eyes that meant they had understood they were being photographed and had held themselves accordingly. Thomas Caldwell looked like a man who had understood nothing at all. Wren put the photograph down on his work table. He stood in his darkroom, surrounded by the smell of chemical developer and fixing solution, and he told himself it was a trick of the plate, a minor defect, nothing to be concerned about. He framed the portrait and sent it to the Caldwells' address on Pemberton Square without further consideration. He did not think about Thomas Caldwell's eyes again until the following February, when a constable named Price knocked on his studio door and asked if he would be willing to come to the Caldwell residence to assist with an inquiry of a sensitive nature. Before we continue with what Arthur Wren found at that house on Pemberton Square, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this story. And drop a comment letting us know what city you're watching from, because sometimes the darkest secrets are hiding just a few streets from where you're sitting right now. Constable Daniel Price was 41 years old, a practical man who had spent 18 years in Bristol's municipal police force and had learned to speak about terrible things with a professional evenness that sometimes, late in his career, quietly frightened him. He told Wren, on the walk from Marchfield Lane to Pemberton Square that February morning in 1885, only the basic facts. A neighbor, Mrs. Clara Fowler of number 16, had reported a smell. It had been persistent for several weeks. She had first attributed it to a dead animal beneath the floorboards, which happened in the older houses along that row. But the smell had grown, and by the second week of February, it had become impossible to ignore. She had knocked at the Caldwells' door twice. The first time, Margaret Caldwell had answered and told her the house was being treated for a rodent problem. The second time, no one answered, though Mrs. Fowler was entirely certain she had seen the upper curtain move. She had gone to the police. The Caldwells' house on Pemberton Square was a substantial four-story terrace house built in 1841. The square itself was not fashionable. It occupied a middle space between respectable and modest, the kind of neighborhood where small businessmen and their families lived carefully within their means. Number 14 had cream-painted window frames that had not been touched in several years and a small iron gate at the front that Price pushed open with practiced steadiness. The smell hit them on the front path. It was not an animal smell. Wren had lived in cities long enough to know the smell of something dead in an enclosed space, and this was similar in character, but entirely different in scale. It was heavy, pervasive, deeply organic, with an undertone he could not name but that his body recognized before his mind did. He stopped walking. His feet simply stopped. "Steady," said Price without looking at him. They knocked. No answer. Price had brought a constable's authority and a locksmith named Beale who said nothing and opened the front door in 40 seconds. The interior of the Caldwell house was dark. The curtains on every window in the front rooms were drawn. In the hallway, which was narrow and papered in a deep green pattern of climbing vines, the smell was overwhelming. It came from upstairs. It also seemed to come from everywhere, embedded in the wallpaper, present in the fabric of the curtains, sitting in the very air like something with physical weight. In the front parlor, they found Margaret Caldwell. She was seated in an armchair next to the unlit fireplace. She was dressed in her day clothes, a dark blue dress with a lace collar, and her posture was entirely correct, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the wall opposite, where a framed portrait hung, the portrait Arthur Wren had taken in October. "Mrs. Caldwell," Price said. She did not react, not to her name, not to the sound of the door, not to the sudden light Price brought in from the hallway. Wren looked at her face and understood immediately that she was not simply ignoring them. She was somewhere else entirely. Her eyes were open, focused on the portrait across the room, but the quality of her focus was entirely absent. She looked at the photograph the way a person looks at something they have already seen 10,000 times, long past the point where it requires attention. Clara was not in the front parlor. Price found her in the kitchen, wrapped in a coat and 2 blankets, sitting on the floor next to the cold stove. She was alive. She was conscious. She looked at them with the particular expression of a person who has been waiting for rescue for such a long time that they have stopped actively expecting it. She was 15 years old. She had not left the house in 3 months. "Where is your father?" Price asked her. She looked at the ceiling. Price and Wren went upstairs. The upper rooms of 14 Pemberton Square occupied 2 floors. The first upper floor held a master bedroom, a sitting room, and what had originally been a nursery now used for storage. The second upper floor, the attic level, held 2 additional rooms, one of which was locked. The smell, on the upper floors, was beyond what Wren was able to process rationally. He held a handkerchief over his face and breathed through his mouth and told himself to keep moving. The locked room was at the end of the upper corridor. The door was a plain wooden door, painted white, with a brass keyhole that had been stuffed with white cloth from the inside. Wren could see the edge of the cloth from the corridor, packed carefully, deliberately. Someone had wanted to prevent the smell from escaping. The smell had escaped anyway. Price tried the door, locked solidly. He called down for Beale the locksmith. While they waited, Wren noticed something on the floor of the corridor, a wooden tray of the kind used to carry food between floors, a plate, a covered dish, a cup. They had not been used recently. The food on the plate was gray and completely desiccated. The cup held the remnant of something that had once been milk. Someone had been bringing food to the room behind that locked door, and at some point, they had stopped. Price saw the tray. He said nothing, but Wren watched him breathe once, slowly and deliberately, the way a man breathes when he is preparing for something he cannot prepare for. Beale opened the lock, in 30 seconds. Before we go into what Price found when Beale opened that lock, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what's coming. And tell us where you're watching from in the comments. This story gets a lot darker before it gets any clearer. The room at the end of the upper corridor of 14 Pemberton Square had once been a bedroom. A narrow iron bed stood against the far wall, a chest of drawers, a small window, its curtain nailed shut at both edges so that no gap existed, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a single straight-backed chair positioned beside the window. On the bed lay Edward Caldwell. He had been dead for approximately 3 weeks, according to the medical examiner's report filed the following month. The cause of death was determined to be cardiac arrest, though the examiner's private notes, later reviewed as part of the constabulary's inquiry, contained the phrase "significant physical deterioration consistent with prolonged confinement and self-neglect." He had locked himself in that room. He had not been imprisoned by anyone. He had gone in of his own accord, and he had remained. On the chair beside the bed, they found a leather journal. Brown, unembossed, the cover worn at the corners from years of handling. Price took it with a cloth and brought it downstairs. He and Wren sat in the kitchen of number 14. Clara had been removed to the care of Mrs. Fowler next door by that point, wrapped in the Fowler family's spare coat, and Price opened the journal to the first entry. It was dated March of 1882, 2.5 years before the portrait session at Arthur Wren's studio on Marchfield Lane. Thomas Caldwell had died in February of 1882. He had been 19 years old. The cause was pneumonia, which had moved with terrible speed, 5 days from the first symptoms to the end. He was buried in St. Mary's Churchyard on Redcliffe Hill on the 14th of February, in a grave that would later be confirmed by the sexton as containing only an empty wooden casket. The journal explained everything. Edward Caldwell's first entry, written 3 weeks after his son's burial, was calm and entirely methodical. It described a decision he had reached, that Thomas would not truly leave the family, that the separation was simply unacceptable, that there were methods, known to men of science and to undertakers who specialized in preservation of remains, that could extend the physical presence of a human body far beyond what ordinary circumstance allowed. Edward had spent the 3 weeks following the burial researching these methods with the patience of a man solving a business problem. He had spoken to a chemist in Bath who dealt in specialized preparations. He had read 2 texts on the subject, both in German, which he translated slowly with a dictionary in the evenings after Margaret had gone to bed. What he had done to Thomas's body was described in the journal in a handwriting that remained completely steady throughout. He had exhumed the casket 6 nights after burial. He had transported the body to Pemberton Square in a wooden packing crate, working alone in the deep hours of a March night. He had prepared the room at the end of the upper corridor. The preservation process was documented with the precision of a man describing a commercial transaction. The chemicals used, their quantities, the frequency of application, the modifications made when early results were imperfect. The journal covered 2 full years of this process. Thomas Caldwell, in the locked room, had become something that was technically still a form of his former self. Present, maintained, arranged each morning by his father in the chair by the nailed window so that the light fell across him in a way that Edward had decided was appropriate. The family had accommodated this. That was the passage that Price read 3 times before setting the journal down. The family had accommodated it. Margaret had continued running the household. Clara had continued attending school until the autumn of 1884. When something had changed, the journal described it only as complications with the preparation and Margaret's increasing difficulty accessing the upper floor, and Clara had been kept home. The 3 of them, and Thomas, had continued living together in that house for 2 years. The portrait session in October of 1884 had been Edward's decision. He wanted a record, a proper family portrait, with all of them present, with Thomas included. He had managed Thomas's presence at Wren's studio through what the journal described as the chair apparatus, a modified chair with concealed internal supports that allowed Thomas to be positioned and held upright during the session. The pallor Wren had noticed, the absolute stillness, the eyes that did not quite focus. Arthur Wren had photographed a family of 3 and a preserved corpse, and he had not known. What he had known, in some wordless part of himself he could not then name, was that something in that studio was wrong. The cold that seemed to come from Thomas's side of the room despite the coal fire. The smell he had attributed to chemicals carried in from his own darkroom. The quality of Thomas's face that he had thought was reserved composure. And then there was the portrait itself. Wren looked at it again now. at the framed print that Margaret Caldwell had been staring at from her chair in the darkened parlor, hour after hour, day after day, for months. Thomas stood behind and to the right of Edward, exactly as he had been positioned in the studio. His eyes were the ones Wren had noticed in the developing tray, wide, absent, fixed on a point slightly to the left of the camera. Every other member of the family had the small, specific dimness in the eyes that meant they had understood they were being photographed and had held themselves accordingly. Thomas Caldwell looked like a man who had understood nothing at all, a man who was no longer entirely certain what understanding meant. Constable Price closed the journal. He sat in the kitchen of 14 Pemberton Square for a long moment without speaking. Then he said quietly and without inflection, "He brought them all to have their picture taken." Wren said nothing. "He brought all of them," Price said again. The portrait on the parlor wall watched them from across the hallway through the open kitchen door. Before the final chapter of what happened to the Caldwell family, and to the portrait itself, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and let us know where you're watching from. Some of the most loyal viewers have told us they watched their first video at 2 in the morning, alone in the dark. We understand completely. The investigation into the Caldwell family of Pemberton Square occupied 6 weeks of official attention before being quietly archived in the Bristol Constabulary records under a classification that, in plain language, meant situation resolved without viable prosecution. Edward Caldwell was dead. Margaret Caldwell was admitted to the Bristol Lunatic Asylum on Fishponds Road in March of 1885, assessed as suffering from profound melancholic dissociation with elements of morbid fixation. She would remain there for 11 years, until her death in 1896. She never spoke coherently about what had occurred at Pemberton Square. On the few occasions when the asylum's physicians were able to draw responses from her about Thomas, she described him consistently in the present tense. Clara Caldwell was taken in by her maternal aunt, a Mrs. Violet Ellsworth of Clifton. She was 16 when the investigation concluded. She never returned to Pemberton Square. By all accounts, a brief mention in a church directory, a marriage record from 1893, she made a quiet life for herself in the west of Bristol, married a solicitor named Porter, had 2 daughters, and did not discuss her family with anyone who did not already know. Thomas Caldwell was given a second burial in March of 1885 in the churchyard of St. Andrew's in Clifton. The ceremony was attended by Constable Price, a clergyman, and no family members. The casket was sealed before being brought to the churchyard. The attending physician's report noted only that the body had been treated with chemical preservatives of unusual thoroughness. The report did not describe what Thomas Caldwell appeared to be after 2 years in the upper room. Price had instructed that it not be described. Price himself retired from the Bristol Police in 1889. He moved to Weston-super-Mare and opened a small news agency on the seafront. He was known in his new community as a quiet man who read constantly and slept poorly. He declined. On the 2 occasions when local journalists approached him about the Caldwell affair to discuss any aspect of it. He died in 1902. His daughter, in a letter to the Bristol Evening Post written in 1921, mentioned that her father had kept a single item from his years on the force, a small object he would not identify, wrapped carefully in cloth in the bottom drawer of his desk. After his death, she had found it. She had not described it publicly. She had not kept it. She wrote that she understood, upon seeing it, exactly why her father had never slept well. Arthur Wren continued his photography studio on Marchfield Lane until 1891. He was considered a skilled and well-regarded portrait photographer throughout that period. He worked with the same chemical equipment, the same developing trays, the same darkroom. He produced hundreds of portraits in the years following the Caldwell inquiry. He told one person about what he had observed on the day the Caldwells came to his studio. His apprentice, a young man named Harris, who recorded the account in a private memoir donated to the Bristol Records Office in 1954. Harris wrote that Wren had said the following once, on a slow afternoon in 1887 while developing a portrait of a church choir. "The difficulty with photographs is that they do not know the difference. They record what is placed before the lens with complete faithfulness, and they do not make the distinctions we would prefer them to make. I understand now that a photograph of a living person and a photograph of something else can look, in almost all respects, identical. What differs is very small. It lives in the eyes, and even then, you have to know what you are looking for." He paused. Harris wrote for a long time. Then, and sometimes you see it when you are not looking at all. The portrait of the Caldwell family, the framed album in print that Margaret had spent the last months of 1884 staring at in the darkened parlor, passed through the evidence inventory of the Bristol Constabulary, where it was held for 18 months. In 1886, it was released. There is no record of who claimed it or where it went. In 1923, a photograph dealer in Bristol's Corn Street Antiques Quarter purchased a collection of Victorian family portraits from a house clearance near Redcliffe. Among the collection was a family portrait, 2 adults, 2 young people, a painted garden backdrop, an October light, in a plain wooden frame. The dealer noted that the family appeared prosperous and respectable. He could not sell it. Every customer who looked at it for more than a moment put it down without explanation. He sold the rest of the collection piecemeal. The portrait remained on his shelf for 3 years. He eventually gave it to a man who said he collected such things. The dealer did not record the man's name. He said later that he had been relieved to see it go. That there had been something about the portrait, specifically about the young man standing at the back, that had unsettled him from the first day he unwrapped it from the crate. His eyes, the dealer said. They were open in a way that didn't fit the rest. The family was posed. He wasn't. He had examined a great many Victorian photographs in his career. The Caldwell portrait was the only one that had ever seemed to look back. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know this channel is not for everyone. Drop a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from, because the darkest secrets in history are rarely where you'd expect to find them. Give this video a like if the story stayed with you tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Somewhere out there, in a house clearance lot, in an antique dealer's shelf, in a drawer wrapped in old cloth, there is a photograph of a family, and something in it is not what it appears to be.